According to the most recent episode of Kentucky Afield, fishing is a $1.2 billion industry in Kentucky. Fishing is big business. Largemouth bass are the most sought after game fish in the United States. In Kentucky, we believe we could maybe do a little bit better job growing some of those bigger fish by supplementing Florida strain or specifically F1 tiger bass in some of our lakes in the eastern part of the state. A lot of our lakes are a little deeper than some of the lakes found in other parts of the country, and as we found with our threadfin experimentation, it has allowed the threadfin to survive some winters when mortality should have been high due to water temperatures getting down around 40 degrees. When you compare Smith Mountain Lake that's spitting out these double-digit bass and these incredible bags of fish, the climate and the elevation are eerily similar to Paintsville, Kentucky. So northern strain bass or Florida strain bass, what's the difference? Largemouth bass were distributed widely throughout the United States in the 1800s. Florida strain bass were likely distributed from the 1950s, 1960s on, when it was realized that the lineage in Florida had some traits that were desirable in northern states. So what are F1s? They're a mix. In our case, we've advocated for stocking F1 largemouth bass for a long time in Kentucky. The reasoning is simple. F1s are bred specifically to get to larger sizes potentially and to be more aggressive, potentially more catchable. If you read the 2020 Bassmaster article talking about the introgression line of Florida genetics in the United States, you noticed that there were several quotes in there from the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, one saying no Florida bass here, and that our native bass had evolved over a long period of time, and that adding Florida alleles potentially to our population could be detrimental long term, causing things like outbreeding depression. In 2022, after challenges from our group, specifically a swab, at Paintsville Lake, they found a mostly northern population, but they did find a slight percentage of Florida genetics. And with that slight percentage of Florida genetics, they found two fish, 21% Florida. For years, the state said the only way that Florida alleles got to our state were by anglers throwing them in a live well and trucking them back up here to Kentucky. Now, we all probably know that happened. Somebody went south, they caught a couple big fish, and they thought, well, I'll help the local lake and, take those fish back, and we can potentially grow some bigger bass. When you look at the history of DNA sampling in Kentucky, there are a lot of big gaps. The most extensive set of testing was recently conducted in 2022 when they sampled 27 lakes statewide. Interestingly enough, even when they sampled the Minor Clark fish hatchery, they found one fish in the hatchery broodstock that was 60% Florida. So last year in Kentucky, they dug a hole at Minor Clark and they buried over 600 largemouth from 2 to 9 pounds. Unbelievable.
East Kentucky anglers are coming together to improve the region, not just by fishing, but with science. WIT's Jordan Mullins has more about the results of a recent angler-driven study and how it may impact the region.
Anglers for Improving Opportunities, or AFIO, is a nonprofit searching for ways to improve fisheries across the region. Most recently, the nonprofit has great interest in stocking eastern Kentucky lakes with F1 bass, an intergrade bass, which is a 50-50 hybrid mix between Florida largemouth and northern largemouth bass. AFIO, with some help from anglers with the Kentucky Team Trail, conducted a study in April 2022 on Paintsville Lake's bass population. AFIO President Jason Kenner says experts believe the lake's bass population was almost purely northern DNA, but anglers set their hooks into some new data.
We had 97 samples that day. We sent those off to Stephen Barden with Major League Fishing, who's helped us throughout this entire process. And then he sent those to Auburn, which is the same place that I guess everybody in the country sends their data for DNA evidence.
The study determined that Paintsville Lake actually had a large population of bass with Florida largemouth DNA present.
We would bet if you did a private sample on many smaller ponds, especially those found in mining territory in eastern Kentucky, that you would likely find a much higher percentage of Florida alleles, something that probably mirrors Highsplint, just because we all know those mine owners and those mine bosses had unlimited resources at one point in time. We all know they traveled to Florida. They all probably discovered the same thing around the period of 1960 like they did in California. They drove to Florida and caught some bigger bass and thought, why can't we do this at home? So they brought some of those fish back. If bass anglers are moving fish, there are likely other anomalies out there with higher percentages of Florida genetics. The point here is that the Florida bass alleles are already expressed in the population, and we are adding nothing new as far as genetic material. All right, so this is a 2021 article, Florida Strain Bass Changed the World of Bass Fishing, written by Bill Rice. And I think this is a great summation of where the obsession with Florida genetics came from. It's called California's Whopper Story. You know, this is a magazine cover from back in the day. You know, it says that Orville Ball, who was the director for the City of San Diego Recreation Department in the mid-50s until around 1969, he had traveled to Florida with a pro baseball player named Ray Boone and an outdoor writer named Rolla Williams. So when they traveled to Florida, they were catching some big bass, and it was Boone who wondered aloud why the bass that they caught during spring training in Florida were so much larger than those of in his hometown of San Diego. This obviously led to a discussion in the boat of whether the fish were genetically different relative to growth potential, or if the issue was environmental. And I think it's interesting, you know, as you scroll through here, it says skeptics scoffed at the idea, too, saying that the bass in Florida, which grew larger than any other largemouth bass in the nation, was simply a product of Florida's warm, near tropical environment. When transported to other waters, these Florida-bred bass would adapt to the local conditions and become just another bass. Boy, were they wrong, the author says. And I think that's where this conversation is so interesting, because time's eventually going to tell the story here. Somebody's eventually going to run the experiment. The article goes on to say that those early experiments surpassed even the most optimistic expectations of those involved. By the mid-1960s, fish weighing from 6 to 8 pounds began to be caught regularly in several lakes. By 1969, the results were astounding at all of the San Diego City lakes, changing the face of bass fishing not only in California but nationwide. Spread nationwide. Now, coincidentally, in Kentucky, Greenbo Lake has a unique status that earned it a special place in Kentucky angling lore, the only body of water in Kentucky to produce 2 consecutive state record largemouth bass. What makes the story truly amazing is that both fish were caught by the same man, Delbert Grizzle of Flatwoods. Caught the bass within 11 months of each other. One on September 21st, you're never going to guess the year, 1965, and the other on August 3rd, 1966. So when you think about the 1960s, obviously people were traveling to Florida from Kentucky and every other state. And that's why we've believed all along that Florida bass are probably in a lot of private impoundments for sure throughout the country unknowingly. And there's probably a lot of this experimentation that we're on the back end of. They haven't been supplemented in a while. And if the genetics aren't continually supplemented, they don't stay around and produce these amazing results. It was interesting though, Greenbo Lake, 50 largemouth bass selected. On average, largemouth bass alleles accounted for 74.8% of the total largemouth bass. So this is 60 years later, all right? And the rest were Florida bass alleles. So without a documented stocking since maybe the 50s, the 60s, who knows, right? Now the most interesting details down here at the bottom. Additionally, Greenbo Lake was privately owned prior to state park ownership, and the origins of the initially stocked fish are unknown. Who wants to bet they're pure Florida? Kentucky's other state record fish, Dale Wilson's 13-pound, 10.4-ounce brute from Wood Creek Lake, taken April 14th, 1984. Now, again, in 84, this is again very coincidental to California, and the success there was some of the biggest bass, and one of our biggest bass grown in 1984. So you can bet that Wood Creek probably had some Florida alleles or Florida bass stocked in it at some point in time in the 60s, 70s, who knows? And we think this is evidence. Now, when you look at our state record bass in Kentucky, this is where the conversation gets the most interesting. Mark Ward, 14-pound, 9.5-ounce state record largemouth bass. Now, when we started in 2022, no DNA on this fish. Now, the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, to our understanding, has run down a sample, and they found that this fish was 60% Florida, and it came from a population of fish that was 60% Florida in Highsplint Lake in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Now, 2 things. Highsplint's a very small lake. It's amazing how many of these trophy bass from across the country come from these small lakes. So you can do a simple Google search like I did, and most results will tell you that a Florida bass can grow to 20 plus pounds and can live up to 17 years, while a northern bass can grow to about 10 pounds and only lives about 12 years. So when you look at the state records on the map, to me, number one, the first thing that jumps out is the size of the lakes. A lot of these are smaller lakes. Number 2, a lot of these fish look to contain Florida genetics just based on the size. You know, if the upper limit of a pure northern strain largemouth bass is 10 pounds, a lot of these fish are 11, 12, 13, 14 pounds. So that being the case, you know, several states obviously jump out and beg the question here, did they contain Florida genetics? Now, a lot of these fish are lost to time. Mounts probably don't still exist, so going back and getting a genetic sample, just like on the world record itself, is probably not gonna happen. So in the mid-1980s, almost 40 years ago, the state of Tennessee conducted a statewide DNA assessment on largemouth bass. and they found there was a slight presence of Florida alleles throughout the state. They began experimenting with smaller lakes in Tennessee and stocking Florida strain genetic. In 2000, they began the famous Chickamauga experience, and they began stocking fingerling Florida strain largemouth bass in an attempt to change the overall genetic composition of the lake, which was less than 5% of the time, to 15%. After 5 years of stocking, they were unsuccessful. They hadn't even accomplished raising Florida alleles to 5% population-wide in Chickamauga. In 2005, Tennessee increased the size of their Florida strain stockings, and the results dramatically changed. 2010, you began seeing record bags out of Chick. 2015, a state record was caught, and there were some amazing bags of largemouth bass caught at this time in Lake Chickamauga. Most importantly, they had shifted the genetic composition of the population to approximately 33%. So what about other northern states having success with F1 largemouth or Florida strain stockings, like North Carolina, Virginia? At this point, shouldn't there be documentation of outbreeding depression or some of those other theories that are presented by state organizations when F1 stockings are proposed? In Paintsville Lake, we've worked alongside the Eastern Fisheries District for about 3 years now to improve habitat, to promote harvest, to improve the forage base, and pretty much address any other allowable environmental factor that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Kentucky Fish and Wildlife would allow us to address. And we thought if we took advantage of those steps, that we could set our lake up to a point that if we were granted permission to stock F1 largemouth bass, we could potentially grow maybe a double-digit bass. In Kentucky, we believe a lake that regularly produced a double-digit bass would be worth millions to a local economy in one of these rural areas around many of our lakes. We started an experiment 3 years ago through our local fiscal court and through tourism to fund 150,000 threadfin shad, 50,000 stocked for each year over a 3-year period. In the 1990s, the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife conducted a similar experiment, but with a smaller density. They stocked 15,000 shad 3 years in a row. They ruled the work futile because the threadfin didn't survive the winters and eventually cut that experimentation off. Some people my age remember at a younger point in time when you could go out and fish what we called the jumps, or those threadfin when they were schooled up close to the surface in the late summer and fall, and the largemouth bass would just be out there foraging on the buffet of small threadfin shad. It's been probably the biggest success so far is revisiting the threadfin experiment. You know, like I said, in the 90s, the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife did 3 years at a density of 15,000 stocking threadfin shad, eventually ruled it futile because they just couldn't prove that they could survive our winters. You know, we believe 30 years later the winters are a little milder for whatever reason, and we felt like it was maybe a chance to revisit the threadfin shad issue. So when you look at threadfin versus gizzard, which are found in most of our lakes, threadfin have a couple huge advantages. Number one, in a mature threadfin adult is about 3 to 5 inches. So it's the perfect big bass meal or small bass meal. The other thing about threadfin is they reproduce potentially 3 times per year. You know, in our situation, Fish and Wildlife has evidence that they reproduced 3 times 2 years ago in 2023 and at least 2 times last year in 2024. So those multiple shad reproduction events are big for pretty much every predator in the system, and especially those smaller predators because they keep some of that forage base, you know, in that smaller size range. On the Aquatic Biologist Facebook page, and you know, he specifically says that what do threadfin shad, copper-nosed bluegill, Florida bass all have in common? They're all warm water species. Dead threadfin are the first to go. The shad are the biggest wimps. Copper-nosed are tougher, but when they go, the Florida bass are not far behind. So in our case, if our threadfin survive over this 3-year period, shouldn't the Florida bass? So far, those threadfin have survived all 3 winters. We have really encouraging numbers so far this spring. In our experience, we've seen just as many threadfin as we had gizzard. You know, and if you remember at the start of this experiment, number one, they said the 40-degree temperatures in the winter, if water got to 40 degrees, it would be fatal for our shad. So far, it hasn't, or reproduction has at least gotten it to a limit to where that we can withstand some of those wintertime kill-offs. You know, it's pretty common for lakes with threadfin shad populations to have wintertime kill-offs. But as of now, Paintsville Lake is the northernmost lake with a threadfin shad population that doesn't have a warm water spring or a power plant operating in that lake. So Paintsville Lake's probably had as much done around the lake in the last few years as maybe any lake, at least in the eastern part of the state. You know, thanks to a local group separate from Anglers for Improving Opportunities, Casting for Kids recently helped design and construct with Chris Ferguson ADA handicap boardwalk down at water level to allow kids to get out and experience fishing. It's just an amazing project. Casting for Kids also hosts one of the largest, if not the largest, kids tournament in the country at Paintsville Lake. Last year was something like 1,200 kid fishermen. You know, this year that tournament's scheduled, as well as the regular Casting for Kid adult event, which is a team tournament here based out of Yatesville and Paintsville Lake. The tournament also has a large economic impact locally, as many of those anglers travel to our part of the state, stay in hotels, dine in our restaurants, spend money at our bait shops, and frequent our gas stations. You know, Jason Russell and our local guys out here, they just incredible to work with. You know, any idea that we've pitched at them, you know, they've looked at feasibility and worked with the Army Corps of Engineers. On the habitat side, we've received several grants. You know, we recently got a grant from Friends of Reservoirs to get the large concrete balls that you're seeing around several lakes now in habitat projects. You know, the concrete balls, they really have an added benefit in that you can go back and you can add more structure to those over time. But over the last few years, we've taken part in several projects. The first, you know, we built the TP pallet structures with the cedar trees attached to them. You know, Frankfurt deployed their entire habitat team down here, and we put a great project together with some of the state fisheries biologists and went out and deployed those in several sites that are marked on Paintsville Lake on the map that's accessible on the Fish and Wildlife website. From there we moved. We also used some plastic, some of the Shelbyville cubes. We've deployed those. And our local biologists and their team have come up with a stump structure that they call it, where they use a concrete block and we're attaching 4 pieces of corrugated pipe so that it looks like a stump when it's sitting on the bottom of the lake. Some really great work. The thing that we really like about the stump structures is that, one, that they're easy to handle. We can really build a bunch of those things with a group or a team in one day and get those things deployed. Our Fish and Wildlife out here has some great equipment to dump those things in the lake, and you know, so far those habitat projects have been an incredible success. You know, we've deployed some of those around the ADA boardwalk. You can clearly see, you know, the corrugated pipe. There's 5 pieces coming up, you know, out of the top. You can clearly see that standing up, you know, in these clusters of structure here. You can actually see some fish just cruising around. You know, a lot of bank fishermen. One of the most encouraging things about this project so far has been the number of fishermen that you see every night, you know, taking advantage of this boardwalk and the opportunity it gives. All in all, it's been a great team effort. You know, we went out last summer with a bunch of high school kids and we felled trees all over the lake. The Corps approved us to fall over 100 trees. And, you know, those laydowns are some of the best habitat for bass, especially in the early spring, you know, when some of those fish first pull up.
One tree, baby. One tree. One freaking tree. That's the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life.
So one question that we constantly get asked is, are those trophy fish that our lakes are currently producing the ones with the highest percentage of Florida genetics? You know, and that's one thing we're trying to identify. We've worked with our local fisheries biologist, Jason Russell. You know, he's been really generous in coming out on a few occasions and grabbing some fin clips of those trophy bass that anglers have landed. And that's going to better help us understand the situation there and what's actually going on. But like I said, our theory currently is that some of those larger fish likely have higher percentage of Florida genetics. So catchability is another subject that requires investigation as it relates to F1s. In a recent article published on Realtree.com, there were several interesting quotes from the TWRA. Electrofishing produced 20% F1s, and bass caught in tournaments by anglers resulted in 60% of them being F1s. Does that justify the gap in our data versus the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife data from our swabs and their fin clipping at Paintsville Lake? Does this prove that to truly understand our lakes, we need to combine angler catch data with state data? Probably. It's important to understand that we sampled 97 fish and the KDFWR sampled 100 fish from Paintsville Lake. This is probably less than 5% of the total population of bass in the lake that we are drawing assumptions on. Can you grow another state record bass without Florida genetics in Kentucky? The data says probably not. So we'd really like to encourage guys, you know, please don't move bass. You know, count on your state to do these things, and you know, hopefully we can proceed with these F1 stockings and experiment what role those genetics can play in our state in growing more trophy bass.
We sincerely appreciate your time. Please follow our group, check out the posts on the page, get involved in the conversation and get involved in your local area, and let's leave this better than we found it.